Yeah, first, thank you all for joining us with the GRC call. I'll do some introductions real quick. From the Data Magic side, we've got Shane Kimbrell, the owner of Data Magic, been in business since 1994, and myself, I run the sales and marketing. And from a GRC side, our subject matter expert is Max Pruger, who'll be doing the presentation today. I'll give you a brief kind of rundown of what it's going to look like. Max is going to do an overview. So I know that some of you came to us, we're looking for HIPAA or SOC 2 or PCI compliance or CMMC compliance. All of you are on this call. We're not really going to do a deep dive into specifics. However, at the end of the call, what I'd like to do is, if you do want a deeper dive, please put your hand up or put something in the comment. I'd like to learn more, and I will reach back out to you and schedule a deep dive with our GRC partner here. So the agenda is going to be, we're going to kind of do a broad overview of what the GRC tool does, how logical the approach is, and how it works, how it steps you through the process of becoming GRC or anything certified, compliant, ready. Then we'll do a Q&A. And after the Q&A, I'll reach back out and ask, is anybody interested in a deeper dive? And then we're going to have some fun and give away some Rangers tickets to those of you that have joined us. So you must be present to win. And with that said, Shane, do you have any other comments?
No, I was just going to say, when you come on, just put your comment in anything in the comment field to make sure you're in there for the drawing. And then Gary will get everything kicked off on that. Max, take it away. Appreciate you coming on here to kind of give a little guidance on where we're going with this compliance piece. So,
all right, well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me. And not just the HIPAA or CMMC, but there's the FTC safeguard rule, and PCI 4.0 is coming out, and Texas has their own state laws and so on. So, while compliance and GRC is the most exciting topic in the world for me, I know it may not be for everybody else. So I'm going to try to keep this relatively high level. I'm just going to do an overview, and then, to Gary's point, happy to stay on and answer as many questions and do a more in-depth dive on any specific framework or standard. So with that being said, I am sharing my screen. If someone can validate that they can see my screen, I will get started.
Good.
Yep, we see it.
All right. So pretty easy agenda today. I'm going to talk about what is and isn't compliance. So we talked about security assurance versus compliance. So I'll talk about the difference between those two. What's the current landscape, the threats and opportunities, and what's going on in the industry today. This should come as no real surprise to anybody. And then I like to end it with a real world example. So we talk about accurate and thorough a lot. So we mentioned, Gary mentioned HIPAA, the number one most enforced violation for the OCR, which is the Office for Civil Rights, which is the enforcement body for HIPAA, and pretty much every other standard out there, is a failure to conduct what they call an accurate and thorough risk assessment. So lots of check boxes, lots of questionnaires out there, but if in the event of an incident, you have to actually be able to prove that what you say you have is actually what you have. So I'm going to step through an example of that. And then, of course, at the end, I'll leave time for Q&A. So with that being said, I'd like to start off talking about what is compliance. I used to have this really long legal definition, and I ran across this one, and I thought that it was perfect. So in its simplest form, compliance is having to meet requirements set by others. So it's anything that anybody else makes you do, and whether that's a government entity, whether that's your insurance company. So I'm hoping everybody on this call has some amount of cyber insurance. But if you look at cyber insurance, it's just a legal contract. Inside of it, there's terms and conditions. And in the event of any type of incident, if you want to maximize your payout, then you've got to be able to prove that you were actually complying with those terms and conditions. I think what's more important than understanding what compliance is what it is not. So first and foremost, compliance is not optional. Everybody on this call is delivering or having their IT services delivered using some sort of best practice or framework. And, we'll talk about the different frameworks that are out there. So again, whether it's HIPAA or PCI or SOC or whatever it is, or, whether it's Max Pruger's best practices. And by the way, Max Pruger has the best IT security services best practices in the world, third-party industry or regulator that's out there. So if you're using Max Kruger's best practices and an incident does occur, no one's going to care. That's why you want to follow either a required framework or an industry recognized framework. Compliance is not one and done. So I often say that compliance is not one and done. So I often say that compliance is a journey, not a destination. You are never done with compliance. There's, for HIPAA, they call it best effort, continuous improvement. So the worst thing you can do is nothing. You've got to do something. And then once you've done that something, you've got to maintain your compliance over time. So again, lots of compliance frameworks like a HIPAA or a SOC 2, like a HIPAA or an FTC safeguard rule. It's best effort. You have to do your initial security risk analysis and so on, and then it's continuous improvement. There are frameworks like CMMC. So if you deal with the government DoD space, there's a certification at the end. So what they have is certification and then continuous compliance. And then finally, compliance is not security. They do go hand in hand, but you can be compliant and not secure. You can be secure and not compliant. The ultimate goal for every organization out there is that you want to be both compliant and secure. All right. So security, cybersecurity versus governance and compliance. And by the way, I define compliance as anything that anybody else makes you do. So I might as well define governance. So governance is anything that you make yourself do. So when you're at home and if you have children and your best practice is that when they come home, they close the door and they lock it, that's governance. So you're going to ensure that they're locking that door when they come home. So again, cybersecurity is protecting your data. Governance and compliance is being able to prove it. So when it comes to protecting data, you've got your basic IT services. I'm assuming that this is everything that DMI is providing on a regular basis. So things like antivirus patching, firewalls, user management, and so on. You got your advanced IT security services, so your DNS filtering, your SOC, so Security Operations Center as a service, your VPNs, incident response. I've got multi-factor authentication there as advanced IT security. I should probably move that over to basic. If there's one thing you take away from this call, is that you should be doing, at minimum, multi-factor authentication. If you do just basic multi-factor authentication, I believe that the FBI said that would reduce cyber attacks by something around 70%. So if you haven't implemented that, again, I encourage you to implement that across every single application that you touch, whether it's on-prem or whether it's in the cloud. So what is governance and compliance? As I said, it is meeting outside obligations, and you do that through documentation. So first and foremost, those outside obligations, the nice thing is with compliance, you're not reinventing the wheel. So all the documentation is out there. It's what our GRC platform does. It literally takes all the requirements, all of the controls, and it lays them out for you with details and guidance and information and descriptions and tells you this is what you need to do. So as an example, talk about CMMC. CMMC is based off of NIST 800-171. You don't have to remember all these things, but NIST 800-171 has 110 requirements. You literally just go through those 110 requirements and check them off and provide evidence that you're doing it. So first and foremost, you need to align your cybersecurity with your IT requirements. If you are in a regulated industry, so like finance, like HIPAA, like Department of Defense, subcontractors, and so on, it's easy. They tell you which one you do. If you are not, then at minimum, you want to align it with some sort of industry best practice. Validate compliance with all of your requirements. So again, the requirements are laid out. You're just going to validate that you are meeting those requirements. You want to identify your compliance gaps. So typically one of the first things that you're going to do is you're going to run an audit. It's going to create what's called a POAM, a plan of action and milestones, where it's going to identify all the requirements that you're missing. And it's going to create a risk analysis that says, these are all the risks that are potentially in your particular environment. So you identify those gaps and then you document. In the compliance world, if you did not document, it did not happen. So again, in this industry, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, you are guilty until proven innocent. So if an incident does occur, the assumption is that your data was breached, it was exfiltrated, and it's available out in the wild. So it's your responsibility, your technician's responsibility, your IT provider's responsibility to ensure and to be able to effectively prove that no data was exfiltrated during any type of attack. I also like to use this slide here. It's a security and compliance requirements. I talk about security and compliance really being a three-legged stool. And like every three-legged stool, if one of those legs is missing, it is going to fall down. Most organizations, especially if they're being actively managed by an IT organization, are pretty good on 2 of the 3 legs, but where most fall down is on that third one. So if you look, those 3 legs are policies, procedures, and evidence. And when you break it down, policies are very easy. Policies rarely change. So as an example, hopefully every organization has a password management policy. So that says you are going to manage your policies in some way. That way is a procedure. So procedures define how you're going to implement those policies. So for example, maybe in 2010 or 2006 or 2012, your procedure was that you were going to change your password every 90 days. And that's fine. That's totally appropriate for that particular time frame. But procedures, unlike policies, do change over time and change more often than policies. So today, as I mentioned, multi-factor authentication could be a new procedure for your policies. And as long as you document it and are able to prove that you're doing those things, then you're meeting that policy. And then finally, like I said, most organizations are pretty good at 2 of the 3. That's the policies and procedures. Where most organizations fall down is on that evidence side. So you have to be able to audit and prove and document that you are actually meeting those policies by implementing those specific procedures. And again, just to reiterate the point, if you cannot prove it, then the assumption is that you did not do it. And this is actually the second slide I use in most of my presentations because compliance can get confusing. Security assurance, talk about security assurance, which is really just being able to prove that you're delivering or your IT services are being delivered in a secure manner. There's lots of acronyms, there's lots of laws. Again, there's a lot of information that's out there and it's changing frequently. So just to kind of clarify, at a high level, there are lots of laws. So HIPAA is a law. So the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. GLBA, Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, is a law. Anything that ends in the word act is a law. Lots of states have their own data breach laws. In fact, every single state in the United States, including Puerto Rico and DC, have breach notification laws in their books. Texas has actually one of the more stringent privacy laws of any state in the union. So they're similar to like California and New York and so on. So again, lots of laws. Then you have rules. So some laws have rules. If you're in the healthcare industry, HIPAA has 3 rules. They have the security, privacy, and breach notification rule. If you process credit cards, congratulations, you are subject to PCI DSS. PCI is not a law, it's an industry-specific rule. Again, if you are in the Department of Defense space, you are subject to DFARS and CMMC. And you don't have to memorize any of these acronyms, but just understand those are rules. And there's a bunch of rules, FFIEC, NCUA, FDIC, that is for financial institutions. I mentioned cyber insurance policies, and the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act has the FTC safeguard rule. So if you are a auto dealership, if you do any type of end user financing, so if you're an accountant and you provide tax returns, so somebody can get their tax returns 2 weeks early or 4 weeks early, providing financing, so you are subject to the FTC safeguard rule. But at the end of the day, you've got laws, you've got rules, and then you've got frameworks. And there's lots of frameworks out there. So the NIST cybersecurity framework, that is the most, I would say, widely recognized framework. That is a government framework. Got CIS, which is a industry framework. They all kind of overlap. ISO, there's a bunch of other ones. And the way that you comply with the laws and the rules is by implementing a framework. So in this particular example, if I personally wanted to comply with HIPAA or the FTC safeguard rule or my cyber insurance policy, then I would implement either NIST cybersecurity framework or CIS. On the other hand, some rules and laws tell you specifically what you have to implement. So if you are part of the Department of Defense and you want to comply with CMMC and DFARS, you have no choice. You must comply with the NIST 800-171 framework. All right, so talking about the current landscape, as I said, this should be no surprise to anybody. Compliance is not going away. Anybody who thinks compliance is going away probably wouldn't be on this phone call anyway, but I can assure you that there are just going to be more and more compliance standards and regulations and requirements and so on. In fact, typically most of the compliance requirements stay relatively static, but that is changing very quickly. So HIPAA is getting an update this year. PCI is going to version 4 from version 3.5 this year. CMMC is launching their final rule potentially at the end, by the end of this quarter, maybe going into Q2. And as I mentioned, lots of states are passing their own thing as well. So in addition to that, we don't have a federal standard yet in the United States. So we don't have a GDPR equivalent. So as I mentioned, Texas, California, Virginia, and so on are passing their own laws. But there is something out there. It is called COPRA. You can say you heard it here first. Stands for the Consumer Online Privacy Rights Act. It's a bill that's been making its way through the Senate probably for about the last 3-4 years. But it will eventually get passed. Large corporations, so you think of a company like Amazon or Microsoft, they don't want to have to try and comply with 50 different state regulations. So they're looking for a national regulation that they can comply with. So eventually, I doubt it'll happen this year because it's an election year, but eventually we will have the equivalent of GDPR in the United States. And if you look, 83% of business owners expect an increase in regulations and compliance. I don't know what the other 17% are thinking, but we're definitely going to get more of that. And we already see it. As far as the consequences go, again, most of this should come as no surprise. There are real consequences to not complying with state, federal government, industry regulation. So first and foremost, and again, I'm not trying to scare people here, it's just the reality of what it is. You've got government regulators. So I mentioned the OCR, which is the Office for Civil Rights, which is the enforcement body for HIPAA. That's what they do. Every single data breach over 500 patient records must be reported to the OCR within 60 days, I believe. Some states make it less. Any data breach, even under 500 patient records, so even one has to report it within a year. And then the OCR investigates every single data breach. So that is required. They can also randomly audit, but if you have a breach, you have to report it, and then that one will be investigated. But as you can see, I won't go through all the details, but in 2008, I'm not sure if you can see my little mouse here, there was almost no fines and penalties. So HHS, which is the parent of OCR, went to the government and said, hey, nobody's doing this stuff. So they said, okay, you can start fining folks. And they said, okay, great. And so they hired a bunch of auditors and regulators. They started some fines, and the odds of getting fined were pretty close to zero, since I think they had something like a total of 10 auditors for the entire United States. And so they went back to Congress in 2015 and said, hey, people still are not complying. And so Congress said, okay, anybody you fine, you can keep the money for yourself. No surprise, as soon as the OCR was able to keep the money for themselves, fines skyrocketed, and you can see they're continuing to increase. So, obviously you've got government regulators, you've got the SEC, the FTC, lots of them, and they're expanding their authority and so on. In addition to that, the one that we all worry about, and I'm sure keeps Data Magic employees up all night long, are the cyber criminals. So they're out there attacking, hacking, cyber criminaling, and data exfiltrating all day long. It is typically a shotgun approach, so they're not targeting any particular businesses. And unfortunately, what that means is that for small, medium-sized businesses, you guys are the primary target. So 60 to 80% of attacks target small businesses. Again, just basic math. It's most companies out there are small, medium-sized businesses. And again, they're using typically a shotgun approach where they're emailing in mass. So phishing emails, identifying users. Now you've got tishing, I think it's called, for text phishing. So I actually got an email from my CEO about 2 weeks ago that said, I'm at a conference. We've got 10 really high-end customers here. Please go out and purchase $100 gift cards on Amazon and send me the numbers. Now, luckily, I'm in this industry, so I knew that was fake, but a lot of people don't know it's fake. They're constantly evolving. AI is going to make this even worse. And my mother, who is, bless her heart, in her mid-70s at this point, she sometimes asks me, like, don't these people have real jobs? And I try to explain to her, they make more money at their quote-unquote real job than I make at my real job. So this is a huge industry. It's a multi-billion dollar industry, and they'll continue to evolve and attempt to, attack and make revenue off of this. So with that being said, I think the one that may be a surprise, though, finally, is the fact that you've got lawsuits. So, we all know we live in a litigious society, but I'll go a personal story. So my wife is an attorney. She clerked for a federal judge after she graduated from law school. And I remember I used to go there every once in a while at the federal courthouse, and I would take her out to lunch. And I noticed that there were always people just sitting there loitering. And, back then they're still reading newspapers. Now I'm sure they're on their phones. And I asked her one time, I said, why are these people here every day? They're just sitting here loitering with what seems like loitering. She said, they're not loitering. What they're doing is they actually work for these large class action lawsuit firms. What they do is that they sit here all day. So there's people in every single pretty much courthouse in every state, state courthouse and federal courthouse, and they're waiting for a data breach. Then they get a phone call in that particular state. And so the first law firm that certifies a class makes the most money. So again, there are people that are literally just waiting for a data breach. So with the big ones, like the Target data breach back in, I think, 2010, that one made the news. Google's data breach in Europe, that one made the news. There's lots of lawsuits and so on. So you hear about those, but pretty much at the end of every data breach, there's almost always some sort of a class action lawsuit from the folks, the consumers that got their data exposed. All right, so hopefully this is a growing SMB concern for you guys, but that is definitely the case. If you look at the data back in the day, so awareness and investment, it was almost non-existent back in 2015. So the people were aware of the growing concern for cyber criminals, but most SMBs were not spending any investment on it. Obviously, you can see that has changed. So you can also see that when they asked what were the biggest concerns from an organization in 2015, that was an economic downturn, but regulations were almost non-existent. Today, this was actually 2020, so this is even worse today. You can see regulation and trust had by far the biggest gain. In addition to that, this isn't new. Everything starts at the enterprise level. For those of us who are old enough to remember the .com era, the bubble, whatever you want to call it, that was a fantastic period of time until the bubble crashed. And the poster child of that bubble crashing was Enron. So if you don't know Enron, it's a great story. There's a book called, I think, The Smartest Guys in the Room. And effectively, Enron was a darling of the .com bubble. They grew exponentially. And then it turned out that there was just a lot of fraud involved. And so when the bubble burst, the government came in, as the government does. They passed a lot of laws after the fact to try to mitigate it ever happening again. So you had Sarbanes-Oxley, which is SOX, you had Dodd-Frank Act, and so on. But not only did Enron go out of business, Arthur Andersen, which had been around for over 100 plus years and was one of the big five accounting firms, they were auditing Enron. It was literally less than, I think, 0.005% of their business, but that entire company ended up going out of business because of what happened with Enron. So, if you know anything about business, everything starts at the enterprise level and then kind of flows its way down to mid-market and then small, medium-sized businesses. So we're definitely seeing that. Every single enterprise organization today has a governance, risk, compliance, so GRC platform. They are all generating the required evidence documentation because, again, in the event of an incident, whether it's the insurance company, whether it's the attorneys, whether it's the government regulators, they have to be able to show proof that they are complying with those guidelines. So to be clear, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So the FBI said 75% of small, medium businesses will be attacked and compromised within the next 3 to 5 years. Of those, 60% of small, medium-sized businesses end up going out of business within 6 to 12 months. So the question is, obviously you want to do everything you can to try to protect yourself, but in the event that something happens, how do you recover and how do you protect yourself from the regulators and the auditors and the attorneys? You do that through documentation saying, look, I was doing what I said that I was supposed to be doing, and I was following an industry recognized framework. So again, whether it's NIST or CIS and so on. Who owns this? When it comes to governance, risk, and compliance, historically, it was actually owned by the legal department and some of the accounting department. So pre-2000, it's all about protecting consumer data. And so before the internet, who owned protecting consumer data? Again, it was really the legal department. So all the data was in a file cabinet, the legal department would store it all and so on. But now with obviously the internet out there and all the data being available online, so it is now the primary domain of the IT department. So it's IT's responsibility to secure the environment so that that data is not available to the cyber criminals. Now, legal still has to play a part. You've got your privacy policies, you got your incident response policies, and so on. Accounting has to play a part because obviously there's financial data and so on. But at the end of the day, a large percentage of the responsibility falls on the IT department. So I mentioned that I like to finish up with a real world example. I call this the accurate and thorough example. And just some really quick background here. So this is actually, again, a real world IT company. In fact, they specialize in auditing and compliance, specifically compliance, primarily around kind of mid-sized hospitals. So this particular example, this was an audit of a hospital in upstate New York. So a couple thousand employees and, again, kind of medium-sized hospital. So before the consultant goes in and starts doing any work, he always provides the client a questionnaire. And there's lots of questions. I pulled out a subset of them, but just at a high level, he asked, do you encrypt all of your PHI or PII, so personal data? So PHI is protected health information, PII is personally identifiable information. So if you're in the healthcare space, obviously that's your health info. If you're not, so PII is things like your social security number, your credit cards, your birth date, things like that. And of course, the client said, yep, absolutely. We do encrypt all of our personal data. Are all your systems patched? They said, yep, definitely all of our systems are patched on a regular basis. Are your computers protected against malware? They said, yes, they were. Do your passwords expire? And they said, of course they do. And finally, do you use any unsupported software? And the organization, the hospital said, no, we don't. And so as such, we're compliant. We've been HIPAA compliant for 15 plus years. We're doing all the right things and we've checked all the right boxes. So with our governance, risk, and compliance platform, we do leverage software scans. So the software is installed on machines. It scans those devices, it scans the network, and it actually provides what we call accurate and thorough results. So what the consultant did was they installed our software on the environment. And within about an hour, what he identified were lots of machines that had no encryption on it, that had PHI on it. He identified hundreds of machines that were missing dozens of patches. So you can see in this particular instance, Commvault is missing 76 critical patches. So that's not even regular patches, but critical patches. And then he also identified devices that had no antivirus on them. Further, the scan identified 397 users, enabled users, with passwords set to never expire. So they claimed that they had been, have a 90-day password reset policy, and they were doing that for the last 20 years, and lo and behold, that did not happen. So this scan was actually run in 2020. And as you can see, the scariest one is that there are literally 2 admin accounts with passwords set to never expire, 1 admin account, the password set in 2014 and hadn't been changed for over 6 years. He did also find a secretary. She hadn't changed her password since 2006, but every single year when they were checking those boxes, they claimed that they were setting passwords to expire every 90 days. And then finally, they said, nope, we don't have any unsupported software. He found over 112 programs that were running on these machines. That's just 112 programs. So literally thousands and thousands of instances across that entire environment. So they were running things like Server 2003. Remember, the scan was done in 2020. So that had been retired for over 5 years. It had 327 known high-risk vulnerabilities. And remember also, this is a hospital. If you are in the healthcare space, that is the most attacked space. The value of that data is higher than in any other industry. So, for 5 years, they had that. They were running Windows XP. They had a Windows 2000 machine that had been unsupported for over a decade. Lots of instances of SQL Server, which is a database. And then they had over 680 PCs that were still running Microsoft Office 2007. It had been retired since 2017. So he went back to the client and said, well, I appreciate that you told me that you were doing certain things, but when we ran scans, we actually got accurate and thorough data. And what we discovered was that no, you are not encrypting all of your personal data. As you saw, you have dozens of machines that are missing nearly 100 patches each. Your computers are not protected from malware. You literally have an admin account that hasn't been changed in 6 years, and other accounts that haven't been changed for over 16 years. And you literally have thousands and thousands of instances of unsupported software. So while I appreciate that you've been checking the boxes and claiming that you're doing all of the right things, when we actually look, under the skin or under the hood, we have come to the point that you are not complying with these guidelines, which again is okay as long as you rectify it. So from that point on, they had to start with an accurate and thorough risk assessment and then create a plan to address those risks, the remaining risks over time. As far as the compliance lifecycle goes, it's pretty straightforward. Again, it really just follows one of the frameworks. So under the NIST cybersecurity framework, it's identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So this really just goes into a slightly more detail. First and foremost, you must identify every single thing on your environment, every user, every asset, every network device, and so on. And I highly recommend leveraging software for that because that is a very manual process if you don't. You must generate your policies and procedures. So I will again say, if specifically for HIPAA, if you are in the healthcare space, then at minimum you should have a risk analysis, you should have a treatment plan, and you should have policies and procedures. Those three things will save you a lot of headache. Now you need more than that, but just having at least those three things, again, will save you a lot of headache in the event that an incident does occur. You run your baseline assessment, so you got to know where you're starting from. Once you run your baseline and just get an idea, then you can go and perform a full IT assessment. You generate your plan of action. So once you do your assessment, you're not going to be perfect. I guarantee you. Even the OCR says it takes about 2 full years to kind of fully comply with the HIPAA guidelines. So create a plan. Identify what you want to address this quarter, next quarter, the following quarter, and start that process. You want to address your open issues, collect your evidence. So again, a lot of these things are not even security related. If you have a media notification policy, so if in the event of a breach, if you have a breach and the media gets wind of it and they contact you, you should have a policy. So your secretary should not be picking up the phone and talking to the media about what they think happened. So you should have a plan of action on that one. Engage your employees and vendors. So end user training, vendor risk management. If you're in the CMMC space, that's literally all the CMMC is. It's vendor risk management for Department of Defense supply chain contractors. So this is your supply chain vendor risk management. Perform your internal audits and see what you did. Did you get better? Did you address different requirements? And then, as I said, it is a journey. So once you're done with that, you start with the identify process all over again, and you continue to maintain your compliance. I will say the first assessment you do will always take you the longest. But with the help of GRC, once you do this once, you never start from scratch again. You just continue to iterate and get better and better. And so with all that, again, my name is Max Kruger. I appreciate everybody's time, and I'm happy to stay on and answer questions.
Thank you, Max. I appreciate that. And I think that last slide, or the second to last slide, was an important one because the understanding needs to be that this is it's a two-way street, or in this case, it's a three-way street where, we have the GRC team, the Data Magic team, and you guys play a large role in getting these things done, especially when you get to documentation, and it is a process. I mean, it totally is a process. And, then the GRC team helps and we help in letting you know that that's good, that we've made that step. However, we've missed a small bullet point and we need to correct that before we can check that box. So it's a really great tool for stepping us through it. It's a loaf of bread, and we're going to feed you one piece of bread at a time and let you digest it and then give you the next piece of bread. But understand that you can't go to AI and become compliant. It has to be as unique as your business is. Every plan has to be unique to that business. So no two plans are alike. There's a lot of similarities, but it has to be your business's plan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. It's perfectly said. If I can piggyback and add just a little bit to that, as great as Gary and Shane and the team are, they're not responsible for your compliance. They're responsible for their own compliance, and they can absolutely help you. But at the end of the day, if an incident occurs, it is always the responsibility of the organization to be compliant. So there is effort involved. You have to provide information. You have to provide documentation. Gary and Shane and the software will ask you for that. That will give you guidance. But your incident response plan or your media response plan is going to be different than every other company's because you have different employees, you have different phone numbers. If an incident occurs on a Saturday at 2:00 in the afternoon, who's going to pick up your phone? Who are you going to call? Are you going to call Gary and Shane? Are you going to call your legal attorney? Are you going to call your cyber insurance policy? I mean, depending on the size of your organization, are you going to call the FBI? There's no right or wrong answer. You just have to decide what makes sense for your organization.
So can we open up microphones for Q&A?
So we do have a question from Emily. She says, what are the reporting requirements for Texas FI is breached for employees and dependents?
Okay. So I'm not an expert in Texas law. I can tell you that for PHI, so that means you are subject to HIPAA, federally speaking. If it's over 500 patient records, you must report that to the OCR. I believe it's 60 days. If it's under 500 patient records, then you have a year to report it. To 30 days, I don't think Texas lowers it, but I could be wrong. You have to look at your own. You have to look at requirements for Texas. But PHI, it's HIPAA. PHI, it's HIPAA. It's federal, so you've got to report that within. From a federal perspective, 60 days. If it's over 500 patient records, 1 year if it's anything less than 500. And then sadly, you get added to what's called the wall of shame. So every OCR breach gets put on their wall. They don't like people calling it the wall of shame, but that's what everybody calls it. And that is reported and available for anybody to search.
Yeah, and there are companies out there that are basically keeping track of what companies score when it comes to their cybersecurity. And especially the bigger you are, the more at risk you are for getting on these lists. But what I compare it to is like having bad credit. If you have a breach, the only thing that takes that off of your record per se is time, and then just proving that you controlled whatever type breach happened in your organization. But I feel like that's going to become more prevalent. That information's out there, different ways of gathering it. Could be public domain, but then there's also research that's done on the back end. And some of these larger companies are using those databases to make decisions whether they're going to do business with companies.
Yeah, I'll say it's even worse than that. Cyber criminals are evolving too. So there was recently a case where a hacker, they hacked a healthcare organization, and the healthcare organization did not report it to the OCR within 60 days. The hacker called the OCR and reported it. So the organization did not pay the fine, the ransom. And so the hacker actually called the OCR and reported or went online and reported that organization. So that's one. Another thing that cyber criminals are doing, especially for healthcare data, is they're also now contacting. So it used to be they would just lock it, and then you would pay them to unencrypt all of the data. They're actually what's called exfiltrating the data. So that means they're actually taking the data, they're going through it, and then they're contacting the patients, and they're ransomwaring the patients and saying, if you don't give us X number of dollars, we're going to publish your information. So, especially when it comes to HIPAA, I like to say that, HIPAA is not about compliance, it's about patient care. There's a lot of really personal data that people have in their healthcare records, and they don't want to have that exposed. So, you want to do the right thing for those patients and try to protect their data as well.
I think Emily just had a follow-up question. Is it the same for a patient versus an employee? An employee is a non-healthcare company. I think she's just saying people are outside of healthcare. That's what she's asking.
So remember, HIPAA stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. If you deal with insurance, so if you are doing private practice that's cash only, you're not subject to HIPAA. So again, I don't know how to answer that question without more details, but if you are an employer and you provide health care to your employee, and that employee's personal healthcare information that is in your control gets exposed, then potentially yes. But even if it's not yes under HIPAA, that's a violation anyway. So they can sue you for releasing their personal information. But again, if you're talking about from a reporting perspective and putting that and sending that to OCR, if you're not a healthcare company, if it's not insurance related, then you don't have to report that to the OCR. You may have to report it to the state of Texas as a data breach.
Yeah, I liken it to the two biggest things that you would worry about as a business owner or in leadership is losing a very large customer because you sent a virus through their email or what have you, and there goes all that revenue. And then the second is to get sued. So to have your business be compliant or compliant ready and have this process in place, it's the greatest insurance policy that you could possibly do for your organization.
Yep. Yeah. In fact, it's more important than cyber insurance because
yes,
if you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, then don't rely on your cyber insurance to pay out. And there's nothing against insurance companies. Insurance companies have a very easy business model. They take in premiums and they pay out claims. In the middle, they take a little portion for themselves, but it is a legal contract. They will take in premiums based off of you complying with the terms and conditions in their contract. And if you have an incident, they're happy to pay as long as you are continuing to comply. If you don't, then there's no legal obligation for them to pay you a settlement if you're not complying with those guidelines.
And it does lower your insurance, the more of these controls that you have in place. So you do get a little bit of return on your investment, but it don't make that the main reason that you do it. Obviously, you want to do it to protect yourself so you're not having these awkward conversations with clients, employees, just everything that goes along with the breach.
Yeah. And I don't want to throw in too many statistics and kind of a high level overview, but I just saw that the average downtime for a small, medium-sized business is $8,000 per hour of lost revenue. So, even the best IT companies that I've talked to that are doing everything right, that have incident response plans, have business continuity plans, and so on, usually take 2 to 3 days to recover an organization that's been ransomwared. So you can do the math, 8,000 times however many hours in a couple of days. That's why 60% of small and medium-sized businesses end up going out of business and not surviving after a 12-month period.
We had one comment from Shane, just wondering the new requirements that NIST is putting out for passwords. Have you reviewed that? And just
so I know NIST is coming out with version 2.0. So we're working on that right now. They're adding I said it was 5 functions. They're adding actually a 6th function, which is literally called governance. And I haven't gone through what the new password change recommendations are. I know they're trying. So it used to be, that's kind of why I use that example. In the old days, they wanted you to change passwords every 90 days. Microsoft is actually kind of at the forefront of this, saying, hey, if you force users to change passwords every 90 days, it actually results in less secure passwords because people forget them. So again, I haven't gone through all the details, but yeah, exactly. So what I was going to say is that my guess is that they've been pushing for either passwordless, or that's why I mentioned 2-factor authentication using text messages are okay, the Twilios, but actually get yourself an authenticator app. They're free. You can get Microsoft, you can get Google, Authy. There's a bunch of them that are out there, and leverage a 2-factor authentication app. And not changing your passwords every 90 days, because then you can have a secure password, but at the same time, you have at least one, if not multi-factor option on top of that to secure your passwords.
Right. And that's kind of what Shane was saying, basically, and what he's reading into it is just the frequency is not as important as it is for just in case you do get a breach, then make the changes on it. Makes sense.
Yeah, and there's so many different dark web monitoring tools, so I definitely recommend using a dark web monitoring tool. I don't know, Shane, if you provide those, but you scan the dark web. I mean, I get hits all day. Your password was compromised, or somebody got hacked, and so on. Also, I am a big fan of password managers. So today, my passwords are typically 24 characters long. And they're completely random characters and numbers and alphanumeric characters and so on. So in the event that one does get compromised, I'm not reusing that password in multiple places. So big fan of that as well. And all I have to do is remember like a really complicated password one time, and then the password manager takes care of everything else.
And single sign-on is big right now too. where you can have all of your apps in one place as an organization. So that's something to look into. And there's lots of different options for multi-factor. So
yeah, it's always a trade-off, security and convenience. Security is not convenient. That's the whole point. If it was easy and convenient, then anybody could get in. So you got to trade off the balance of how secure do you make it. There's another framework called Zero Trust, which is kind of the highest level. And with Zero Trust, so we actually implement Zero Trust. And what that means is that about 6 times a day, I have to go into my authenticator anytime I want to log into anything and put my password in and so on. But that's a trade-off that we're willing to make based off of the data and security, that the levels that we want to have.
absolutely. Well, Max, we appreciate you coming on here and trying to make cybersecurity fun again.
There you go. Well, I appreciate you guys having me. Happy to answer any different questions that may come up after the session. So if anybody thinks of anything afterwards or didn't want to ask their question publicly, happy to address those after the fact.
Right.
Super.
Gary, let's get to the fun part.
Yeah. One last thing for me is that I know we have a couple of folks that are on this call that are either going down the path or close to going down the path. So you don't really need to reach out, but anybody that is interested in looking at your certification, right, or compliance needs, regardless of what it is, and you'd like more information, please just drop me a note in here and I'll be sure to follow back up with you. I can set up another webinar based on what your needs are. So it's a heck of a lot, more of a deeper dive. Thank you all for joining, and let me know if you need any more information. I'd be more than happy to set something up for you all.
We appreciate you, Max, and thanks, Gary, for putting all this together. Have a nice rest of the day.